484,071 visitors arrived by air to Hawaii in April 2021. Prior to the pandemic, Hawaii experienced record-level visitor expenditures and arrivals in 2019 and in the first 2 months of 2020. Only 4,564 visitors traveled to Hawaii in April 2020. Visitor arrivals in April 2021 were down 43.0% from the April 2019 count. Visitor spending was down 38.4% from $1.32 billion spent in April 2019. According to preliminary statistics released by the Hawaii Tourism Authority (HTA), a total of 484,071 visitors arrived by air service to the Hawaiian Islands in April 2021, compared to only 4,564 visitors who traveled to Hawaii in April 2020 when tourism to the islands virtually ceased due to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Total spending for visitors arriving in April 2021 was $811.4 million. Prior to the pandemic, Hawaii experienced record-level visitor expenditures and arrivals in 2019 and in the first 2 months of 2020. When compared to 2019, visitor arrivals in April 2021 were down 43.0% from the April 2019 count of 849,397 visitors, air and cruise, and visitor spending was down 38.4% from the $1.32 billion spent in April 2019. April 2020 was the first full month of travel restrictions to keep the community safe, following the state of Hawaii's 14-day mandatory travel quarantine for all passengers, effective March 26, 2020. During this time, exemptions included travel for essential reasons like work or health care. The state's 4 counties enforced strict stay-at-home orders and curfews in April. Nearly all trans-Pacific flights and inter-island flights were canceled. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC) enforced a no-sail order on all cruise ships. On October 15, 2020, the state initiated the Safe Travels program, which then allowed trans-Pacific travelers to bypass the quarantine if they had a valid negative test for COVID-19. A year later, in April 2021, the Safe Travels program was still underway, with most passengers arriving from out of state and traveling intercounty able to bypass the state's mandatory 10-day self-quarantine with a valid negative COVID-19 NAAT test result from a trusted testing partner prior to departure. Kauai County rejoined the Safe Travels program on April 5, 2021. The counties of Hawaii, Maui and Kalawao, Molokai also had a partial quarantine in place in April. The CDC continued reduced restrictions through a conditional sail order on all cruise ships. In April 2021, 352,147 visitors versus 3,016 visitors in April 2020 arrived from the U.S. West and 119,189 visitors versus 1,229 in April 2020 were from the U.S. East. In addition, 1,367 visitors versus 13 visitors in April 2020 came from Japan and 527 visitors versus 9 visitors in April 2020 were from Canada. There were 10,842 visitors versus 298 in April 2020 from all other international markets. Many of these visitors were from Guam, and a small number of visitors were from other Asia, Europe, Latin America, Oceania, Philippines and Pacific Islands. U.S. West visitors spent $573.2 million. U.S. East visitors spent $233.7 million. Visitors from Japan spent $4.5 million. Visitor spending data from other markets were not available. A total of 3,614 trans-Pacific flights serviced the Hawaiian Islands in April, compared to 426 flights a year ago. This represented a total of 727,980 air seats, up from 95,985 seats. There were significantly more scheduled seats from U.S. West, 623,611, plus 703.7%, and U.S. East, 80,172, plus 3,646.4%. Air service from Japan, 8,798 seats, plus 1,082.5%, Other Asia, 2,224 seats, plus 920.2%, and Canada, 716 seats, none in April 2020, remained limited but there were more scheduled seats compared to a year ago. There continued to be no direct air service from Oceania. Scheduled seats from other countries, Guam, Manila, Majuro, decreased 8,589, minus 10.4%. Year-to-date 2021. For the first 4 months of 2021, total visitor spending was $2.33 billion. U.S. West visitors spent $1.56 billion, U.S. East visitors spent $737.5 million, and visitors from Japan spent $15.5 million. Available data for Canada showed $17.2 million in visitor spending in the first 2 months of 2021. A total of 1,331,115 visitors arrived in the first 4 months of 2021, down 37.5% compared to the same period a year ago. There were more visitors from U.S. West, 925,145, plus 1.5%, but fewer visitors from U.S. East, 367,038, minus 28.8%, Japan, 4,277, minus 98.5%, Canada, 4,243, minus 97.3%, and all other international markets, 30,412, minus 86.4%. Additionally, cruise ship activities continued to be suspended in 2021. In comparison, 29,792 visitors came by cruise ships in the first few months of 2020, prior to the CDC's no-sail order. Total visitor arrivals decreased 60.6% when compared to year-to-date April 2019 arrivals of 3,376,675 visitors, air and cruise. Visitor spending declined by 60.0% from the $5.81 billion spent in the first 4 months of 2019. Other highlights. U.S. West. In April, 280,222 visitors versus 2,327 in April 2020 arrived from the Pacific region, and 71,925 visitors versus 650 in April 2020 came from the Mountain region. In terms of accommodations, 48.5% of U.S. West visitors stayed in hotels, 22.6% stayed in condominiums, 12.1% stayed in rental homes, 10.9% stayed in timeshares, and 10.7% stayed with friends and relatives. Through the first 4 months of 2021, visitor arrivals increased from both the Pacific plus 1.8% and Mountain plus 10.3% regions. Year-to-date, daily visitor spending averaged $170 per person. In terms of travel restrictions, California issued a travel advisory that recommended caution and suggested self-quarantining for unvaccinated Californians returning to the state. In Oregon, returning residents were advised to practice self-quarantine for 14 days after arrival, with the exception of asymptomatic travelers who had received a complete dosage of the COVID-19 vaccine and recorded a minimum of 14 days since their final dose. In Washington, returning residents who were fully vaccinated with an FDA-authorized vaccine did not need to get tested before or after travel unless required by the destination, and did not need to self-quarantine. U.S. East. Of the 119,189 U.S. East visitors in April, the majority were from the South Atlantic, 28,626 visitors, versus 345 in April 2020, the East North Central, 23,568 visitors, versus 198 in April 2020, and the West South Central, 23,019 visitors, versus 283 in April 2020, regions. In terms of lodging, 55.3% of U.S. East visitors stayed in hotels, 16.0% stayed in condominiums, 13.8% stayed with friends and relatives, 11.2% stayed in rental homes, and 9.3% stayed in timeshares. Through the first 4 months of 2021, visitor arrivals continued to decline from the West North Central, minus 45.5%, New England, minus 30.3%, Mid-Atlantic, minus 30.2%, East North Central, minus 22.9%, East South Central, minus 20.8%, South Atlantic, minus 19.8%, and West South Central, minus 6.8% regions. Year-to-date, daily visitor spending averaged $181 per person. In New York, a quarantine was still recommended for all travelers, including returning residents who were not fully vaccinated. It was recommended that they get tested 3 to 5 days after arrival in New York and consider self-quarantine for 7 days if tested within 3 to 5 days, otherwise for 10 days. Japan. Of the 1,367 visitors in April, 1,265 visitors arrived on international flights from Japan and 102 came on domestic flights. Nearly all, 97.9%, visitors made their own travel arrangements. In terms of lodging, 40.1% stayed in hotels, 23.5% stayed with friends and relatives, 22.7% stayed in condominiums and 12.9% stayed in timeshares. Through the first 4 months of 2021, there were 4,277 visitors from Japan, minus 98.5%. Year to date, daily visitor spending averaged $208 per person. In April, the Japan government required proof of a negative PCR test for all entry into Japan. In addition, all travelers, including returning Japanese nationals, were required to quarantine for 14 days. Canada. Of the 527 visitors in April, 136 visitors arrived on direct flights from Canada to Kahului, while 391 visitors arrived on domestic flights. Most of the visitors were independent travelers, 95.0%. In terms of lodging, 31.4% stayed in hotels, 29.9% stayed in condominiums, 15.8% stayed with friends and relatives, and 11.8% stayed in rental homes. Through the first 4 months of 2021, there were 4,243 visitors from Canada, minus 97.3%, down considerably from the same period last year. Most travelers to Canada, including returning Canadian nationals, were required to take a COVID-19 molecular test when they arrived in Canada before exiting the airport, and another toward the end of their mandatory 14-day quarantine. Most air travelers were required to reserve, prior to departure to Canada, a 3-night stay in a government-authorized hotel. In addition, they were required to submit their travel and contact information, including a suitable quarantine plan, electronically via ArriveCAN before boarding their flight.